encourage students in biblical Hebrew, it actually comes out of the book of Genesis chapter 39, and now I'm going to be pushing a little bit, what that scripture is actually saying. But you'll remember in Genesis chapter 39, it's the story of how Joseph, who had been taken into Egypt as a slave, ends up in the household of Potiphar. And while he's there in the household of Potiphar, we are told at least 4 times, I think, in that passage, that the Lord was with Joseph. He had the Lord's presence with him, even though he was far away from home and he felt far away from God. There are many times you're going to feel like that while you're studying biblical Hebrew, God might seem very far away. Because it's something which is very foreign. But in the encounter that Joseph has with Potiphar's wife, you'll know that Potiphar's wife has got designs on Joseph, and she tempts him, to engage in illicit activity. Joseph, because he's aware that he's dedicated to the Lord, that the Lord's presence is with him, he resists that temptation, but that gets him into trouble. It is when Potiphar comes home that Potiphar's wife says to Potiphar in relation to Joseph, because now she's turning on him and spreading lies and untruth about him. She says, and in fact in older versions of the NIV, which does not occur any longer in the modern versions adds a word because I think they picked up the redundancy. Potiphar's wife says to Potiphar what many students feel when they deal with biblical Hebrew. She says, "Why have you brought this Hebrew to make sport of us?" She actually also says, technically says this Hebrew slave, because you're going to feel like that. Why has the subject been brought into the seminary curriculum to make sport of us? Because that's how you're going to feel lost for a while. But as I said to you, as my encouragement is to you, it is my task to remove the mystery, and to help you to be able to decode what this language is all about so that you can be successful. So that is what that is all about. Just a brief introduction. You'll know a little bit about me. My name is Lindsay. I used to be the principal here. I spent just more than 20 years here at the seminary until I left at the end of 2019. Went into another ministry and currently in transition from that ministry. But my passion has always been not just to understand the Bible, but to particularly understand the Old Testament, and therefore I've needed to spend quite a lot of time in studying not just the Old Testament, but many of the disciplines relating to that, so that not only can my understanding be enriched, but that my task of preaching and teaching from the Old Testament, that it can reach others as well. And hopefully that will inspire others to make the Old Testament their focus of study if the Lord does call you or lead you to continue your studies beyond the seminary. Because not too many do that. Part of the reason for that, I guess, is that the Old Testament sounds old. It sounds foreign. It does take a little bit of more hard work. It is the biggest section of the Bible as we know it. And there's a lot about it, that is culturally, geographically, and in many different levels far removed from us. And so because, we are New Testament people, gospel people, as we often say, a lot gets thrown to the New Testament or to other disciplines within theology. Very few embark on the Old Testament. But I would say to you, it's a worthwhile exercise, but only if the Lord has really called you or you find it fascinating enough that it's something that you want to study. For me, that journey began very early, even before I started. As a seminary student, I was always interested in the Old Testament and many aspects related to that, and so it was almost natural for me to do that. But yeah, I'm always glad to be able to share as much as possible. So for now, that's enough in terms of sharing. So even though I've met some of you, let's just quickly do a quick round. This is who I am. This is, I think, all of you now, basically your third year of studying. in term academically. You know, I know it might be your 4th year of actually being engaged with the seminary because of the way in which the courses work. Okay, brief introductions. So some of you have registered, or maybe still in the process of sorting a lot of that out. The course outline for this course is on Canvas. I don't know if you've had an opportunity of taking a look at it already. Anybody done so? Not, rather, have you not been able to see the course outline on Canvas as yet? Okay. All right. Yeah. So let me encourage you. You know, I don't want to take the time of going through that. I think that you are familiar with the platform, and if you read the course outline, you will see what is going to be required. I say a lot of things there. Some of it I've already repeated in this class. One of that is that, this is one of those courses that you're just going to have to put in as much time as possible. A lot of hard work in order to get to the point where things make sense, and then you are able to pick up on some of the more difficult issues a bit later. The nature and the format of our class is going to be one in which we recognize that the seminary has gone into a hybrid, platform for being able to teach this class. Last year I did the exegesis course in the book of Isaiah, and we used the meeting camera, the meeting owl as I sometimes call it. And so, I would send out the Zoom link for those who couldn't make it to the class, and so they joined us online. But then one of the things I also did was recorded the class, so that if you missed anything or if there's something that didn't make sense, you were able to access that. I would then post those videos, normally within 2 days. Most of the time I was able to post it the next day on my YouTube channel, but I posted as a private video that I would then send you an email from that channel to be able to give you access. In order to do that, you need to have an email address that's registered on Google. Otherwise you're not going to be able to access that. So I think most of you probably do have that. If you were in my class, like Heb1a and Jay, then you would be able to do that. So please make sure that you have an email address that you've registered on Google, because YouTube works with Google. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to access the video. But once you're able to do that, you can access that as many times as possible, as many times as you need to, in order to catch up on the work. So because I wasn't sure, whether everybody is going to be in the room, for tonight at least, I've not set up an online presence, to have the class go live. But let me say, I'm very happy to do that. If it is going to be the case that some of you are planning because of the distance you live from the seminary or because of other circumstances that you're not able to be here, then I will aim to do that. It does make things a little bit more technically difficult, not so much in terms of PowerPoint, but especially if I'm going to have to use examples, and I have to write them on the board. I don't know how clear writing on the whiteboard comes up on, I didn't think so. And even using whiteboard on Zoom, when you're using foreign characters like Hebrew, you have to prepare them before the time, and so it's very difficult to use off-the-cuff examples, etc. So unless I'm able to get a stylus and things like that that's able to help me to do that live, then we are able to do that. So let me say I'm going to be open to that. However, if the indication is there that you plan on actually being here on a Monday at least, then I'm not necessarily going to plan to record the lecture. Part of the reason for that is you will notice that there's a second class, which we call a tutorial class that has been made available, and that takes place on a Wednesday. So I don't know what your programs are like, and if you have planned to actually be present on a Wednesday. Let me say that I do believe that some of those Wednesdays we're going to need and I would want to use. However, what I'm planning to do is to create for this course as many as possible that are what I call supplementary videos. You know, aspects of the work that I know is going to be difficult to cover in class, but that I will make a video about, that I'll post onto YouTube, and I will make you aware that it's there. Okay? One of the things we also require to do is to give a lesson plan, you know, for our lessons, which technically I've got in place, but you know, Hebrew is one of those subjects where there's such a lot to try and cover in any given lecture period. We in all likelihood are not going to be able to do that, you know, because sometimes when I'm teaching and sharing information, I have to try and sense where the class is at to see if you are understanding those concepts. And I know that concepts in biblical Hebrew can be a little bit difficult to get your head around. You know, and so I do want to go slow enough that all of you, if not most of you, can understand, but sometimes that is not possible, and then I need to move on ahead. But recognizing that I want to find a way of helping you to be able to catch up. You know, because as the class progresses, that naturally happens. You know, some people pick up concepts quicker than others and are able to move in, whereas others, you know, it takes a bit longer for them. And that happens for various reasons. And it's got nothing to do with your levels of intelligence. It's often got to do with the amount of time that you actually spend putting in to learn the concepts and to learn some of the basics. So my plan is, and I'm going to see how I can do that, to try and post as many as possible of those supplementary videos that will help you along. You know, to either repeat some of the things that we've done in class, but then sometimes to focus on certain aspects, because there are going to be grammatical concepts that we're going to have to come across, that we're going to have to cover, that might be difficult, especially in the first go, you know, to try and understand. And that, some of that from experience, you know, I've learned, you know, are some of the things that we need to do. Yeah, and so that's going to be very, very helpful. Let me say, I am aware of the fact that there's a lot available online. You know, in fact, technically, as I speak, there's such a lot of good things on YouTube, you know, in terms of credible people who's teaching biblical Hebrew, that you could actually go to, and some of them are even much better than me, more qualified than me, and more experienced than me in terms of what they teach and how they teach it. So I'm going to indicate from time to time which some of those links, you know, that will be a repetition of what I have taught. It's going to be the same concept, it's going to be very similar. Sometimes there's going to be differences, okay? And a lot of those differences often boils down to pronunciations, you know, because that's going to be one of the things that we're going to have to learn, how to pronunciate biblical Hebrew. But the problem is that the way in which we pronunciate Hebrew today is in all likelihood not the way they pronunciated in the days of the Bible. Yeah? So, and pronunciation, we know, changes. You know, just think about the English language and the many different ways in which English is pronounced throughout the world. You know, so you get American English, but you get British English. You know, they all come from the same origin, but they've got a different accent associated with it, and sometimes they have different spellings, and sometimes they have features that have developed into their language, meanings that they give to words that in another context means something completely different. Okay? And so you do get some of those who's teaching the course, but they will follow what I call American pronunciations. Now part of the challenge there is, as you know, when you move from one language to another, there are certain sounds in languages that it does not occur in your mother tongue. Okay? And that is often what makes it challenging. For example, there are going to be certain sounds we're going to discover in the Hebrew alphabet that are what we call guttural sounds. They are sounds which doesn't actually occur in English. They occur in certain languages. Like for example, there's gutturals in Afrikaans, there's gutturals in Dutch, there's gutturals in German, and there's gutturals in other languages. And so if you've grown up with a language, and maybe also a particular version of English, because English has borrowed words, so it depends which English in which part of the world you are living in, whether you are in a context in which they have words that have got gutturals. Gutturals are the rough sounds that we make, as the word suggests, from our gut, from the back of our throat, even in our throat. They are very rough sounding letters. For example. Ek het vir jou gesê. I've told you something. Or you think of, this is in fact one of the words that we use to illustrate a guttural sound in Hebrew that we use in English. One of the famous German composers was a man by the name of Johann Sebastian Bach. You've heard of Bach? It is that sound, which is spelled CH, that we in English would normally say is ch. C and an H is ch, as in the word chop. But at the end of the word, in German, it represents a guttural sound. A sound in which it's like you're clearing your throat. Bach. That's a guttural sound. And there are some letters in the Hebrew alphabet that depends upon that sound. So if you've grown up in a context where you have not had to use that sound, and now all of a sudden you're learning a language in which that sound has to be made, it could be a challenge. For example, when I was still at seminary under the previous principal, his name was Gerard Venter. Now Gerard, if you translate that into English, we will translate that as Gerard. And you can already hear how from what is more the Dutch pronunciation, even though it's a typical Afrikaans name now, Gerard, that the G represents a guttural sound, a rough sound that is made in your throat. So we had a partnership with some folk in North Carolina, coming from America and coming from the South. They knew absolutely nothing about gutturals. They didn't know how to make gutturals, and even if they tried, they struggled to make that sound. And our very good friend and partner who came from that part of the world, when he met Dr. Gerard Venter, he was struggling to say the word Gerard. And the closest he came to saying Gerard was Herod. Herod, as in Herod the Great. Now there's a relationship between a h sound and a guttural sound in Hebrew. But it's just that challenge. So that's one of the things we recognize. And that's why I say some of those who are very good Hebrew teachers of biblical Hebrew, online, some of those YouTube channels, they happen to be Americans who either cannot pronunciate the guttural sound or they struggle to do that. Some of them do. Some of them can do that because some of them have sometimes been exposed to other languages, for example, learning German, etc. So that's going to be one of the challenges. Now let me say, this is something I'm going to do as I introduce you to biblical Hebrew. At the end of the day, you are not going to be penalized because you struggle to say certain Hebrew words. There's going to be a grace, that we're going to afford you. Because it's not so much about whether you can pronunciate Hebrew and sound like a first language, a native Hebrew speaker. That's not the point. The point is, are you going to be able to pick up the Old Testament text written in Hebrew and to read it enough to be able to show that you understand it, but most importantly, to be able to translate it. Because sometimes you don't even have to pronunciate something properly, but you can translate it properly. And that, at the end of the day, is the goal. That you are able to read biblical Hebrew, to be able to have enough understanding, but the goal is not to make you into a Hebrew speaker. The goal is that you are able to read Hebrew, because by and large now biblical Hebrew is actually an academic language. It's almost like Latin. Latin is still used a little bit, But nobody really speaks Latin except if you live in the Vatican City. Then even the ATMs are in Latin, because Latin is the language of the church. And they use it and they speak it. But nowhere else do they actually use it. And so am I pronunciating it correctly? It's not so much the issue. Okay? So I'm not going to penalize you for that, even though I'm going to encourage pronunciating words, etc., because that becomes a way of learning the discipline and also of learning the language. So there are going to be some of those things, I just want to clarify as we go along. I have a limited time to try and teach you concepts. Therefore, the textbook is going to be important. However, because I know there has been historically a challenge given the cost of the textbook, but now I am aware that some of you have been able to access the PDF that's available online, so that's between us. So the PDF is there. I didn't mention it on Canvas or in my course outline, but I am aware where you are able to access that. And only for the purpose of study and academic purposes, it shouldn't be too much of a problem. But I did not want to promote it as such, just in case I get myself or the seminary in trouble. But if you have it, that is great, because I know purchasing that copy is going to be a challenge, is going to be a problem. However, one of the things I have done over the years that I was able to teach Hebrew was to develop what I call class notes. The class notes that I have, I've also made into a PDF, and I've posted it under files on Canvas. So please make sure you are able to get there, because I know sometimes some people aren't able to access certain parts of Canvas for various reasons. So let me say this, I encourage you to get the textbook, but it is not actually a requirement. I've taught this course for a number of years, not needing the textbook, because my notes, which is based on the textbook and other sources, is actually enough for you to be able to pick up the concepts. It's actually quite adequate. I do use Kelly's vocab list, though, because I think he's got a very good set of vocab lists. So instead of, because it takes a long time trying to type Hebrew on the keyboard, and the keyboard doesn't always cooperate with you, especially in PowerPoint, so I often have to check, is my PowerPoint's correct? Because sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But the notes are there, and so I use Kelly's vocab lists. I tend to follow the same order that he follows things in, and there are some things that I actually just teach directly out of his textbook. Others, I jumble things around a bit, or I approach it from a different angle. So I want to say, yes, that is the textbook. If you're able to get a copy of your own hard copy, because you're wanting to focus your attention and you're wanting to have access to it, that's great. Normally there's a number of copies available in the library, depending on what the size of the class is. You could arrange for long-term loan. Not everybody is comfortable using a textbook on a screen, so if you have it as PDF and you use it with PDF reader, some people are able to do that quite comfortably, others maybe not. So yeah, if you are comfortable with it, at least you have access, that is good, that is very important, and that is going to be able to help you. There are other textbooks available online, where people in pre-publishing a textbook on Hebrew, sometimes they make that available. So I've not necessarily pointed you in that direction, because sometimes the systems that they use, is a little bit different. So that's just something I wanted to make you aware of. But as I said, having the textbook does help you to work at your own pace. Especially if you are running ahead or if you are lagging behind and you need to catch up. So that's the one thing I do want to say that I've spoken of over there. Obviously, there's going to be different criteria that we're going to use for grading Hebrew. Part of that is going to be vocab test, some of it is going to be grammar test, there's going to be a final test, etc. When I taught this course previously for the seminary and they went hybrid, fortunately at that stage I only had a single student that I needed to make sure got through the course, and so we were able to find a way of doing things, especially when it came to vocab tests, etc. So that's something that I will check. The person who taught the course just before me, who actually based the course on my outline and using some of my materials, have made some of their vocab tests available on Canvas. I'm busy evaluating that at the moment to see if that's the route I'm wanting to follow. Because normally I would test vocabulary not just on your ability to be able to read the Hebrew to English, but to also translate from English to Hebrew, to write a little bit of Hebrew. So that's something I wanted to check and see how we're going to be able to do that. Yeah, so some of those things, hopefully by next week I'll have them clarified. And if there's any other questions, please feel free to ask me. I've joined the WhatsApp group that has been created for this course, which I think was your Greek WhatsApp group. Feel free to message me. Please feel free to email me, because my email address is also available on the course outline. So please read through that during this week. Don't leave it for next week. Try and do that. What I'm planning to do is, maybe this is the last thing I need to discuss as a technicality or a housekeeping matter, is with regard to Wednesday. Whether Wednesdays are going to be a problem for any one of you, including this coming Wednesday or even next Wednesday. So I'm kind of open-ended about this Wednesday. I'm planning for next Wednesday for there to be a class. So I don't know are any of you going to have a long-standing problem of being able to join a Wednesday class, that extra lecture that has been made available.
I'm going to be doing it online.
You're going to be doing it online. Yeah. Paul?
Also because of I sell in Marina de Gama.
Sure, then that's fine.
So, and right now also the M5 is not the
Right.
place to drive
Sure.
on that.
Yeah.
But I'll do my best.
Okay, yeah. So I wanted to kind of get a sense of that, because that will also determine how I do a Wednesday evening. So as I said, some of the time of a Wednesday evening, I'm going to be putting on a video that I make available, and then my assumption is when we don't have a class on a Wednesday evening, you access that video. And what better time than to do it in the time that you would have normally come for that class. However, you can actually do it anytime you want to. Okay? So I'm wanting to sense in the next 2 or 3 weeks, what we do with that Wednesday. As I said, I'm not necessarily planning that for this week, because there are a few things I need to try and sort out on Canvas with regard to what has been posted there. I need to make the decision whether I'm going to use that, whether I'm going to just allow them to make it come alive so that you can do it, or if I'm going to replace it with other stuff that I'm not going to do. But then definitely posting videos, and some of that is the Wednesday when we get together, I'll do that live so that we are able to cover some of the things. I'm also going to be using it to try and catch up, on some of the Hebrew grammar issues, especially at the beginning, so that we don't lag too far behind. Because I know it takes a while to catch up on some of these concepts. So it will be like a Wednesday class. It's online. We won't be here that evening, but it is going to be made available online, and then you have to access that and you have to use that.
In person or online? The tutorial class?
I'm going to, so when there's a tutorial class, I'm coming into the seminary. I will come into the seminary and I'll present it from here, so that those who are able to come in can come in, and those who can't, can then join us online. The study of Hebrew, and to orientate you to be able to accomplish the goal of being able to pick up a Hebrew Bible or various other resources that are there, because nowadays there's so many interlinears that are available, etc. Parallel Bibles, that makes it accessible. Even on your phone, so on my phone I've got at least 2 Hebrew Bibles, so the tools are there. So how are we able to read it? So I'm going to give you a general introduction to what we call biblical or classical Hebrew, and you will notice that I use as a footer what is going to be one of the first goals that we're going to have to accomplish, and that is to learn how to read the Hebrew alphabet. to be able to look at each letter, know that letter by name, because each letter has got a name, and then know what sound is associated with that letter. So like in English, you know, when you started learning English, for some they've had to do that as an adult. And I know that will be true for some of you. For others, you know, we've grown up with it, and so we started learning it in preschool or in grade 1, and then we learned our ABCs, or as the way in which you normally teach it to somebody who has to learn how to speak English, you learn the phonetic pronunciation of the letter, and not necessarily the way that Barney the dinosaur teaches you. You know, because that is the song, that's the name of the letter, as we say A, B, C, D, E, F, G, you know, and whatever other tune that you learn it by. But by learning the names in English, it's not necessarily an indication as to what sound is associated with that letter. So we might say A and B, but that's not necessarily an indication of the sound that it makes. Because the sound that A makes, generally speaking in English, is R, and the sound that B makes in English is generally B. And C will be K, and D will be D, you know. So there is the name alphabetically, but then there's the phonetic pronunciation that is important, because that is what helps us to be able to construct words. And so that's what I'm going to teach you, so that this funny looking characters over here, you'll be able to begin to understand it, to recognize that that's the alphabet, that you're going to be able to memorize it. So just like you know it, it's true for English or for any other language that you know, that you are able to learn that for Hebrew as well. But that you not only know the name, but that you know what is the sound value, the phonetic value that is associated with that letter. Because that's how we begin to construct words. We put them together. So we might say, cat, the English word cat, is spelled C-A-T, but phonetically it is K-A-T, cat, because it is the phonetic pronunciations of each of the letters that when you string them together, you are able to begin to say words. There's going to be a little bit more associated with that, because there's the issue of what we call syllabilification. Because, you know, when you're dealing with short words, words that only have one syllable, or what we call monosyllabic words, it is easy. But what do you do when you have longer words that's got more than one syllable? How then do we divide the syllables? Because each language has got its rules, and Hebrew will have that as well. So I want to keep it in your face, so that you're able to see it, but we are going to get to the point where we're going to focus our attention on that, and help you to be able to decode it and to understand it. But I want to give you a general introduction. You know, we want to try and land soft. I want to tell you the story, a very brief story about Hebrew, so that you can keep it into perspective. Because you've already learned in Greek that you can't use your Greek that you've learned in Greek New Testament and assume, and here's a bit of a stereotype, pardon the stereotype, and assume that you can go to the Greek-owned fish shop around the corner and order fish using New Testament Greek because that person is Greek. Because while New Testament Greek, as we use it today, uses the modern Greek alphabet and borrows the pronunciations from modern Greek, New Testament Greek is very different to modern Greek. And there's a sense in which that is true for Hebrew as well. Let me say this to you, that there's actually a lot that you're going to be learning about modern Hebrew, because you're learning biblical Hebrew. But you mustn't assume that because you know biblical Hebrew, that you're going to be able to converse in modern Hebrew. It is, however, going to lay a very good platform for understanding modern Hebrew. Okay? But I want you to see it, and so we want you to learn about it. The language of the Old Testament, that's the reason why we study Hebrew, is called classical Hebrew. or as we sometimes just call it, biblical Hebrew. And when we refer to something as being classical, it means generally, especially in terms of language, that what we are learning now as this language is the language as it was used in the Bible era. You know, so besides New Testament Greek that we know is technically Koine Greek. What does the word Koine mean? It means common. It was the Greek that people were using and speaking in everyday society. It was different, even though related to classical Greek, which was the Greek, the technical Greek of the philosophers and the educated people. You know, so sometimes we will use different terms to describe that. We'll sometimes call it English, kitchen English, or language as kitchen, or in Afrikaans they say kombuis, or what they call pidgin. In other words, the language has been so contemporized and colloquialized and borrowed words from everyday life and invented new words that while it sounds like the classical form of the language, it's not exactly that. You know, because language is dynamic. So classical Hebrew is normally the Hebrew of the Hebrew Bible. What has been written, printed, and the grammar that we use to understand it. I'm going to talk a little bit about the development of classical Hebrew. A tiny section of the Old Testament, the vast majority of the Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew. But there is a tiny section that is in Aramaic, that when you open up the Hebrew Bible, it will look like Hebrew, but it's not Hebrew. It's actually Aramaic. So certain sections of the book of Daniel and certain sections of the book of Ezra, that's the largest parts, but in comparison to the rest of the Hebrew Bible, it's very small. Including throughout the Old Testament, there are what we call Aramaicisms, Aramaicisms, words that have been borrowed from Aramaic, which is a separate language to biblical Hebrew, even though it's a cognate language, it's a related language, that have been borrowed and have been retained. Now you notice from the Greek New Testament as well. What did Jesus say when he went to the young girl who had been sick and who had died? Jesus said to her, Talitha kum. Talitha kum is Aramaic. It's not Hebrew. It's not Greek, you know. Because Jesus spoke Aramaic. You know, Jesus didn't speak Hebrew. But it's related to Hebrew. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that relationship. So there are these Aramaicisms that we will also find. There are individual words, you know, that are sometimes captured individual expressions. Modern Hebrew, the Hebrew that is spoken in Israel today, they call it Ivrit. Ivrit is the Hebrew word that means Hebrew. Modern Hebrew is based on biblical Hebrew. And the pronunciation of biblical Hebrew, in other words, the pronunciation we're going to be using, is mainly based on a particular way in which specific Jews pronunciated Hebrew. You see, just like you have today in English, you have got an American pronunciation of English, and you've got a British pronunciation of English, and you come to South Africa, and they say, you speak English, but we like your South African accent. You know, anywhere else you go in the world, anywhere in the world where English is spoken, it is spoken with a particular accent. But besides the accent, there are things that happens that changes in the language, even though it's generally English. And so that's what happened to Hebrew. You know, Hebrew, through the Jewish diaspora, spread all over the world. However, there were certain Jewish communities that ended up in different parts of the world that sought to preserve their culture. When the modern state of Israel was founded in the year 1948, and all these people started coming back to their promised land, you know, whether it was for biblical reasons or for political Zionism, whatever the case might be, they came back and they were all speaking Hebrew, but they didn't understand each other completely. But they're speaking Hebrew. The reason? Because the language has changed. So there was a group of Jews, a Jewish tradition, that ended up in what we call Southern Europe, particularly in Spain. That became known as Sephardic Hebrew. Sephardic Hebrew. There were a number of Jews that settled in Eastern Europe. They became known as and are called Ashkenazi Jews. They had their own way of pronunciating Hebrew. Besides developing what we might call pidgin versions of Hebrew. So you might have, if you watch Jewish movies and old movies, you heard of a language called Yiddish. Everyone know Yiddish? Yiddish is like pidgin Hebrew. That's Hebrew that has been mixed with German and other languages. So that it maintains its Hebrew character, but it borrows in a lot of words from the local languages that gets carried into the language and becomes part of the way in which they speak Hebrew. And then the pronunciations change. And in fact, with some of the letters even, Sephardics and Ashkenazis will have slightly different ways of pronunciating some of those letters. There was a third group, the distinctive group called Yemenite Jews. So these were Jews who were part of the Babylonian diaspora, eventually settled in southern Arabia, in what is modern day Yemen. Many of them immigrated eventually into Israel, and they maintain their own. So what do? This is why we have to standardize. And that's what happened, in the founding of the modern state of Israel. Because you had the Sephardics, you have the Ashkenazis, and you have the Yemenites, we have to decide on one type of pronunciation, and so they settle on Sephardic. So the Hebrew that we will be pronunciating, generally speaking, would be the Sephardic pronunciation of Hebrew. But Hebrew belongs to a broader family of what is called Semitic languages. So people who study languages, linguists, etc., they will normally study language and they will recognize certain patterns. And therefore, according to those patterns, because often one language derives from another language, they will have a family name for that group of languages. So for example, you would have heard of what is generally called the Romantic languages. The Romantic languages are basically some of the languages of Europe that came out of the Renaissance, that many of them developed actually from Latin, but today they are languages like French and Portuguese and Italian, in which they're different, but there's similarities to them. They are called Romantic languages. The languages of the Middle East, many of them fall under the name Semitic languages, because they are actually related. Linguists believe that many of those languages come from one single origin, but they developed into many different languages. The Tower of Babel, if you know your Bible very well, is probably an indication of that. And so how do they do it? Well, if you take a look at what we call the Middle East today, we often refer to it as the ancient Near East. All of the lands around Israel, today Palestine, Israel, so whether you're talking Egypt, or whether you're talking the Arabian Peninsula, or whether you're talking to the north, into the Fertile Crescent, ancient Mesopotamia, into southern Asia, which is modern day Turkey, which was many different people who lived there. In the Bible it's called Asia Minor, but it includes Cappadocia and other areas like that. All of the languages, many of the languages of those areas actually are part of one language called Semitic languages, in which they will fall based upon geographically where they are located. Kind of using the desert, the Arabian desert, as the center of the compass. Languages that occurs in different areas of the compass then gets called Semitic languages by those names. And this is what they were able to do, to try and trace how these languages relate to each other, how they are connected. So most linguists believe that there was a common language that they call Proto-Semitic. The word proto means first, remember from Greek. Proto-Semitic, a Semitic language that maybe has been completely lost now, no longer exists, but was the mother of many of the languages that we find, in which they are able to trace their connection. So for example, you get East Semitic languages, so languages like Babylonian and Assyrian, Akkadian and Eblite, they are called East Semitic languages. Because have you ever asked yourself the question, why is it in the Old Testament that while there are these different nations, that people could generally understand each other? How were they able to communicate? You know, part of the reason was that there was generally, even in the old world, what we call a common language, a lingua franca is the term that is used. A language that is the international language of commerce, which English seemed to have become today. You know, because anywhere in the world, in any business, you know, English. Some people saying one day it might be Mandarin Chinese. You never know. But English has become that. Before English it was what? It was Latin. And before Latin it was what? It was Greek. That's why the Greek New Testament is written in Greek. So what was there a lingua franca? Maybe that lingua franca was Proto-Semitic, or maybe it was, as many people believe, it could actually have been Aramaic. And that's another story. So that's East Semitic, in which they developed their own alphabet to communicate the sound of that language in what we call today cuneiform writing, wedge-shaped writing. That's what the word cuneiform means. And so that has been decoded. You know, when that was discovered, people thought, oh, this is nice patterns, but they suspected it was a language, and using, you know, some of the mechanisms of modern day code breaking, but also understanding how languages work, they were able to decode it. So anybody today, you can go to certain universities and learn how to read that, how to speak it even, based upon certain assumptions around language. But then there is another bigger group called the Western Semitic languages, and you can see that branched out into Central Semitic, as well as, in fact, even in Africa. The Ethiopian language today has its origin within, and its development within Semitic languages. It has the same characteristics and features as Semitic languages, even though it sounds different, and even though they have their own alphabet that they use. But Ethiopian developed into northern, southern. By and large today in Ethiopia, most people speak Amharic, so that's one of the official languages, but they speak many languages in Ethiopia. But Amharic is their main official language, especially when you're in the cities. But as you move in beyond the cities into the villages, smaller towns, you pick up some of the other languages. One of the most interesting one is that one over there called Ge'ez. That's kind of spoken more in the north, but interestingly today within the Ethiopian Coptic Church, just like Latin has been preserved within the Catholic Church, Ge'ez has been preserved in the Ethiopian Coptic Church as the language of the priests. So it's mostly priests that speak Ge'ez today. But here on the other side, from the Central Semitic languages, we can see they developed a whole group. Northwest Semitic languages, in which there was Canaanite. Well, that's where Abraham came into the land of Canaan. There were these many Canaanite city-states throughout the land. They generally spoke the same language, Canaanite. But that Canaanite developed into other languages like Ugaritic, Phoenician, and Hebrew, as well as Aramaic. So these languages over here, they are very closely related. Northwest Semitic languages. And that is why when you can do advanced studies in Hebrew, especially if you can do a study in Semitic languages, you will normally do or be required to do not only Hebrew, but definitely Aramaic. And then you are also offered Ugaritic, because Ugaritic became important because of very important archaeological find in the year 1929 on the northern coast, well actually more in Lebanon today, what became known as the Heb1a or the Library of Ugaritic, where all these tablets were discovered. It was written in ancient Ugaritic. They recognized that this was an ancient language of the Canaanite variety, using an alphabet developed by the Phoenicians. When they were able to decode it, they said, wow, there's a lot of the stuff here that makes sense when we read the Bible. So they recognized that there was a relationship over there. But then, then you've got the old Arabian language, you have Arabic, but then you also have a modern version of that. So you have all these languages that develop their own way of writing it. So that over there is generally what the Phoenician alphabet would look like, from which your modern day Hebrew alphabet is derived. But you've got languages like Arabic, that's written in a completely different script, or Amharic. Might be very small for you to see that, but if ever you've seen an Ethiopian Airlines flight, they have the name Ethiopia written in Amharic, so you look at that funny symbols, that is what that looks like. And then finally what we are going to be studying and what we're going to be looking at is Hebrew. Very different alphabets, but they're all part of the same family. They're all related. So all Semitic languages are believed to have developed from a single ancient Semitic language that they call Proto-Semitic. Semitic languages developed or borrowed from different alphabets, because at the end of the day, what makes a language, what helps a language to be preserved and to last is if you can write it down. Because if you have not developed an alphabet, then in all likelihood, your language can become lost. And there are languages that's being lost. There are projects to try and preserve languages, but that becomes the challenge. How then are you going to translate the sounds made in a particular language? How are you going to illustrate that? And how are you going to develop a useful symbols that's going to help to communicate that, so that your preservation of knowledge is not just dependent upon oral tradition and on stories, but it actually can rely on something that is more tangible, writing. Okay? And that's what helped a lot of languages to be preserved. So here's an interesting fact. The Hebrew alphabet, as we see it today, and as we look at it, actually had its origin from Aramaic. So the font that we use today, that we call Hebrew, technically is not Hebrew. Hebrew people didn't develop their own alphabet. They borrowed the alphabet. And they borrowed the alphabet from Aramaic. They tweaked it, and over the years, it changed till it became distinctive today that we call it the Hebrew alphabet. But technically, it's not. But even that has its origin from the Phoenicians. Because the Phoenicians, the modern day Lebanese, are basically where ancient Phoenicia was. They were highly skilled, highly cultured people that were technologically very advanced, way advanced beyond your ancient Israel was. They were a seafaring nation. They traveled all over the Mediterranean. They built magnificent cities. They even built a temple for Solomon. Because who built the temple? Solomon. Solomon imported Phoenicians to come and help. They import a lot of the materials from there. And the Phoenicians developed their own alphabet. That basically helped them to deal not only with their own language, but many of the Canaanite languages. And it is from that Phoenician alphabet that we get modern Hebrew. But not just modern Hebrew, even the Greek alphabet that you've learned has its origins in the Phoenician alphabet. So the Greeks weren't as clever as what you think. They borrowed. And where did they borrow from? From the Phoenicians. And how could they do that? Because the Phoenicians traveled. The Phoenicians were travelers. They sailed all over the world. And so this little GIF over here gives you an illustration. Because just like Egyptian hieroglyphs You know, what is an Egyptian hieroglyph? An Egyptian hieroglyph is a picture that represents a sound that when you put them together, you actually have a language. You know, and for many years people suspected that that nice decorations on the pyramids and on the tombs, that they were more than just pictures. That they were probably language that has been written by the ancient Egyptians. And how were they able to decode it? It was this marvelous discovery. Not the Philosopher's Stone. The Rosetta Stone. Yeah, the Rosetta Stone. It was the discovery of the Rosetta Stone that helped to break the code that this funny symbols, this beautiful pictures is actually a language. Why? Because the Rosetta Stone is a text that is written, the same text that's written in 3 languages. Hieroglyphs, which is ancient Egyptian. Demotic, which was, let's call it cursive hieroglyphs. A popular way of doing it, because I mean, who else is going to be artistic enough to be able to draw all those pictures, you know? So even ancient Egyptian developed a cursive writing. But then the third language was the key, because the third language was Greek. And they knew Greek. And they says, well, if we've got a stone in which here's Greek, and if this Greek is the same as Demotic and the same as the hieroglyphs, if they're saying the same message, which they did, then we are going to be able to decode that. And they were able to do it by identifying in Greek the name of an Egyptian king. And then discovering how names are written in ancient hieroglyphs in a thing called a cartouche. Have you seen a cartouche? You know, it's a symbol that looks like this. You basically have this, what is like an oval, like that, with a line over there. And inside that, there are some symbols. And they recognize that this symbol here means the name of a person, particularly the name of a king. So, if you are able to find where that king's name is, and you connect it, and you make the assumption, because, you know, if I go to Egypt today and people ask, what's my name? I say, it's Lindsay. And so they have to use their language, Arabic, and try and take each of the letters of my name and have the Arabic equivalent to try and say my name. But they try and keep it what it is. And that's exactly what the Egyptians did. You know, and the Greeks did rather. You know, they knew what the name of the king was, and they put it in Greek. And through that way they were able to decode, you know, and so they knew that's a language. But over the years things changed. So what the Phoenicians did was the Phoenicians developed an alphabet with the same idea. Let's take a picture of something and let's allow that picture translated into a written symbol that will begin to represent not just an idea, but actually represent a sound in our language. So, the first letter of, or rather, what do we call our system of letters? We call it an alphabet.
Alpha, beta.
Yeah, which is alpha, beta. You know, because the English letter A corresponds to the first letter of the Greek alphabet, which is alpha. And the English letter B corresponds to the second letter of the Greek alphabet, which is beta. You put the two together, you get alpha, beta, you get alphabet. Right? And so that's what you do. You find the sounds, the typical sounds that happens in language, and you say, what picture is going to represent the sound? But you don't just do it randomly. You find something that's actually named that thing. So, the first letter of the Greek alphabet is alpha. But the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet is aleph. Aleph. Now, the aleph was actually a thing. And that thing, that word actually can mean different things. But what it typically meant was an ox. So the Phoenicians said, because the same thing happened in their language, because everybody knows what an ox is, you know, the abundance of oxen, It's often in the ancient world, the agrarian world, what is illustrative of wealth. And you're going to see it every day. So that thing, we're going to name it after the first letter, the first common sound we make. And so Aleph, this letter over here, started, as you can see, there, you see that, the head of an ox, which over the years developed, changed into eventually that. And the same thing happened with the letter B. So we are able to trace, therefore, what originally the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet was, actually the head of an ox. What the concept was for what the letter B was, or Beit in Hebrew. The word Beit in Hebrew literally means house. And that, if you understand what the first house was, will make sense to you. Do you know the thing called the Festival of Booths? The Feast of Booths. Have you heard of that?
Yeah.
It's also known by the name of the Feast of Tabernacles. What happens during the Feast of Tabernacles? Jews remember the time that they were in the desert and that they lived in tents. What was the floor plan of a tent? That's the floor plan of a tent. So you have to look top view. Because you come in at the entrance, and they didn't have doors like we have today. You might have a little flat, but you have to have something that kind of shields you from the wind and the way in which you're orientated. And then you come inside. So the floor plan of a tent is the first home in which you live, the first house in which you live. In fact, as they started settling in the promised land, they started using the same pattern. So the tabernacle, which becomes the place of meeting, becomes the floor plan of the temple. But their own tents becomes the floor plan of some of the original houses they built. So that is the floor plan of a house. And so because the word for house is Beit, that becomes the second letter of this sound, which is B, which is the equivalent to our B in English. But over the years it developed until that's what we have today. So there has been developments. However, there are some general characteristics that we need to be aware of. And I say this because, let me say this to you, Hebrew is different. It is different. When you studied Greek, you would have discovered that there's actually things when you study Greek, English begins to make more sense. Why? Because English is a borrowed language. English is not the original. English borrowed. And it borrowed a lot from Greek. Because there's a lot of words today that we have in English that we say is English words are not originally English words. They are Greek words. And think of all the technical words. Theology. It's not an English word, it's a Greek word. Why? Because it comes from theos and logos. Put it together. Theos, logos becomes theology. English word, no, it's not. Its origins is Greek. And that's the same thing that happens. Now, Greek has exhibited features that you have discovered that makes it more versatile than English. Right? Because in Greek, like in English, in order for you to make sense, there's a certain grammatical structure and pattern that you must follow. Right? In a simple sentence, it is subject, verb, object. Right? That's why you do it. The man kicked the ball. The subject is very clear, it's the man. The verb, which is the word of action, is very clear, it's kicked. And the object is the ball. If you change that around in English, you completely change the meaning of the sentence. In Greek, however, because you have things called case endings, you can swap things around. and still communicate the same meaning as long as your case endings clearly indicate what is the subject of the verb, what is the verb, and what is the object. Right? So there was already that difference. Semitic languages, they unfortunately add some other differences that we just have to deal with. And part of that is what makes it strange. One of the things is they are written and read from right to left. So that is why this alphabet, I didn't print like we would do it in English. You start on that side, and it's A, B, C, D, E. No, we're doing it Hebrew. You start on the right, and you read it to the left. So this is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, that's the second, that's the third, etc. When you open up a Hebrew Bible, you will discover it is printed in reverse. Genesis is not on the side where we would normally, it's on the other side. Why? Because you read it differently. When a Hebrew sentence occurs, you don't read it like you read it in English, starting from left to right. No, in Hebrew, like all Semitic languages, you start from right to left. But some of them are so clever, like Egyptian hieroglyphs, you can read it both ways. It can be written right to left or left to right.
Yeah.
It all depends which way the people and the animals are looking. So when you read an Egyptian hieroglyph text, you first have to look which way are they looking, because that tells you where you start reading. Hebrew, you always read from right to left. So that's one of the things that makes it different. The second thing that makes it different that you're going to discover, because you're going to discover that verbs in Hebrew is very important. The most dynamic word in Hebrew is the verb, the word of action. In fact, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the verb, because unlike English, but you've discovered this in Greek, you can have a word that communicates meaning and it's only one word. You can have a full sentence in Greek by one word. You can't do that in English. Yes.
It's time.
Okay, so time up. What is the time now?
It's 7:32.
Okay, sure. Thanks. So that's what makes it different. The other thing that you're going to find, let me close with this, and this one is probably going to get your brains all twisted. You know, when we communicate, and you've seen this in Greek, in a verb, the issue of the tense of the verb is very important, because it communicates when the action was done. In fact, Greek even adds some others, punctiliar. Yeah? So you not only have a past tense, not only have a present tense, but you have a future tense. And then you've got punctiliar, continuous actions, etc. Hebrew is not concerned about tenses. Strictly speaking, and technically, there's no tenses in Hebrew. There is what is called aspect. They are more concerned about where the status of the action of the verb is than when it happened. It doesn't mean that you can't translate a past tense, a present tense, or a future tense. But it does mean you have to do more work to arrive at the decision. Is this verb past tense, present tense, or future tense? In fact, Hebrew doesn't have a present tense. Hebrew only has technically a past tense that you can translate into a present tense. But it also borrows words. So I'll leave you to think about that. And then we'll pick it up from there.